So good evening. My name is Jessica Brinkley, and I'm a Senior Program Policy Specialist with the National Education Association's ESP Quality Department. And I, along with my colleague, Crystal Fox, who is also a Senior Program Policy Specialist in the ESPQ department, will be serving as your moderators for this evening's webinar. So if you were here to participate in the Resilient and Ready Practicing Resiliency in the Education Community webinar, you are in the right place. The ESPQ department represents and advocates for over 400,000 NEA education support professional members, of which we also refer to as ESP. ESPs serve as fellow educators in the school community and play an important role in supporting the whole student. Our strategic focus is to elevate ESP careers by developing, implementing, and promoting best practices, policies, and professional supports that equip ESP with the knowledge and skills to become empowered leaders, accomplished professionals, and members of a high-quality workforce prepared to meet the needs of the whole student.
Good evening, everyone. Our presenter tonight will be Ms. Tara LaShondra Hornage. Tara is a veteran educator with 20 years plus experience in education and professional development. Tara's originally from New Jersey, and she spent more than a decade incorporating mindfulness activities into her classroom and her professional development work. She's also conducted blended learning courses, micro-credentials, and professional development sessions for various public and private organizations. We're very excited to have her here with us this evening. And so now I will turn it over to Tara.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Jessica. I'm really happy to be here tonight and talking about resilience. It does come into my work quite often as I've been teaching mindfulness in a variety of places, of course. And I do have to say, I don't put this in my bio because I've had quite a few things go into my bio across time, but because we're talking about the topic of resilience, probably the first 10 years of my career, I worked with Holocaust survivors. And I was a history undergrad major and my master's of communications, but I very much wanted to work in the field of Holocaust studies. And I have to say, they were probably my greatest teachers ever. Not that my college professors and onwards weren't wonderful too, but they were probably the best example I was ever given of true resiliency. And of course, in our world of education, we often witness, see, hear different quotes by Holocaust survivors, their families. For younger children, we take things from Anne Frank, but anyone from that period, anyone from that time, and sadly, we don't have too many left that we can speak with, definitely have been amazing examples of resiliency. So I'm here to speak to you tonight about resiliency as it applies to our educational communities. So on our slides, we're going to start with just some objectives for tonight, okay? Which are pretty simple or basic, but we'll try to get to as much of the intrinsic details we can. Understanding the basic foundations of educational achievement for our students, which basically that's our entire community wants this for our students, right? We want the knowledge of self-regulation, how to manage and cope with stress, consistency, perseverance, and empathy. So those are huge pieces. I mean, certainly an hour tonight, we could touch on them, but probably diving into each one for a longer amount of time, like the SEL courses that the NEA offers, or anything that Castle has to offer too, touches on those components. Another objective would, of course, be embodying the characteristics that we just mentioned and modeling them for students, for families, and for colleagues. So we want to, as a person in our educational community, always be able to take what we have learned and model it for our students, whether they're 5 years old, they're 15 years old, or they're 50 years old. We always want to be able to embody and model the behaviors that we find useful in learning and continuing to grow and nurture ourselves. And lastly, furthering develop strategies to help manage and regulate SEL social emotional learning challenges, and becoming a mentor and model for others. So those are really important. I'm going to share with you right now a piece that has to do with resilience, but if you have a piece of paper nearby or a notebook, or if you just kind of want to make mental notes, it's fine. I know it's probably a long day, so if you don't want to be jotting things down, that's okay. And you can always do this afterwards too. But when we look at the word resilience, when we think of the word resilience, what is it that comes to mind? If anybody wants to put some answers in the chat box, you can. And in a moment, I'm going to kind of show you a visual that might help us understand this a little bit better. Okay, so this is a piece that kind of talks a little bit about what resilience is all about. Okay, when we think of the word resilience, these could be other terms, words, ideas that come to mind. Okay, I love this piece on resilience. It comes from the book Onward, and there's actually two. So Onward is a book by Elena Aguilar, and I have to say, if you are intrigued by this topic or yet a little bit more involved in wanting to learn more about resilience and SEL components and things like that, I highly recommend her work. She does amazing stuff for the educational community. So here's some terms that we could look at if we're thinking of the word resilience. And in our communities, if we are an educator, an aide, even if we're working in driving buses with students, okay, we can post a word and have them just kind of give it a little thought. We can put it on a bulletin board in a counselor's office, and we can have them stick up other terms that they think go with resilience. There's a lot of work that you can do with this activity that has to do with resilience. Okay, so here are some things that Elena Aguilar had come up for her book Onwards, but again, they're definitely things that you can work with or work into your classrooms in your communities of learners. So back to our slides, we're going to be looking at just that, our community of learners, and our our educational community defined. Okay, who exactly are we looking at? This is a partial list, if we want to say, of when we think educational community, maybe just the building comes into mind, maybe we just see rows of desks and tables for students, okay? But our community, our educational community is definitely bigger than just a building and desks and teachers and students, okay? Of course, we have our administration and our teachers, we have our paras and our aides, our librarians, our nurses, there are counselors, social workers, other social workers that may be in and out of the school, cafeteria, technology, custodians. We have bus drivers, we have crossing guards and local police that of course might be in and out of the schools doing visits. The students, of course, are part of that community. Parents and guardians, families, a huge part of the community, of course. Sometimes we don't think about local businesses being a part of that community. But I know of a lot of different districts in different states where local businesses love to support their schools. So they're willing to help by giving time and volunteering their time or goods or whatever it may be that may be applicable to assisting in their schools. And so it's really nice to be able to visit some of the schools that have a really large educational community, so much so that local businesses are also helping them. And I've noticed over probably the past, I don't know, almost 10 years that there are a lot of chain businesses that are in our communities that are making ways into their schools. Even places as big as Target, but smaller eateries and things like that are also making ways to help schools in their districts, which is really great. Religious groups too, of course. And of course, if we have firehouses or police squads that are located in those areas, they're a huge part of our educational community. So the big picture would have to look something like, and this might not be the perfect picture, but this one actually was adjusted a bit. of a community of people coming together and working as a whole, okay? And watching students grow and get nurtured and learn, and them being a part of that. And so much so that they're learning about these students and their colleagues and their staff as well, and watching the resiliency in these students as well. And there probably was never as much of a time for teachers to better understand, for students to better understand, for educational communities to better understand what resiliency is all about, more so than the time that we've just come through. And I'd like to say that we're through it, hopefully. But COVID certainly did set a step for us in learning, watching, understanding what resiliency was all about. We saw students coming from some terrible situations, their families in terrible situations, our colleagues, our fellow people at work, our community members, in devastating situations throughout COVID, having to deal with illness, having to deal with being sick, having to deal with families who couldn't support themselves because COVID struck them so much so. People had to move, people had to change their lives, very much so because of the effects of COVID. But yet we saw a lot of resiliency too. So students witnessed other students being resilient. They might not know the name for it. They might not know what they're going to call it, but they just know that they saw their own friends, their own colleagues in class come through a really difficult time where they were used to going out in the playground and having their playground aides help them outside and go to play and do fun things, and they couldn't do it. It was shut down. But yet they came back to those playgrounds, and our playground aides came back to those playgrounds, and they made it just as fun and just as great to be at as it was before. And maybe, 6-year-old little Jimmy didn't know that resiliency is just that, but now we can teach him that. And now we can show him that. I'm not saying that COVID was a blessing by any chance, but we can take good things from bad things, right? We can take a good lesson in this and show our students, show our staff, show our colleagues what we've been able to do, because resiliency is truly being able to get through those struggles, through those stressors in a way where we make it through, we come back. We're not superhumans. We don't come back floating and thinking that unicorns exist, right? No, but we make it through some really tough times, and we can show that, display it, mentor it, and we can also make note of the students that we've seen it in too. So I'm going to just show you this other kind of community graphic that comes from CASEL, and CASEL is a huge component of our NEA SEL courses. So basically we take this part of the circle here, and we break them down into mini units of study. Very interesting, lots of material, but you can see here too that our educational community, okay, is pretty vast, and all of these components inside these circles affect that community. So we're talking about relationships, we're talking about decision-making, social awareness, self-management, self-awareness. We're talking about all of these things, and resiliency touches on almost all of those components. CASEL is a great resource to use if, again, you get more interested in learning more about some of this information. So we're going to go back to our slides. I'm sorry to kind of go back and forth, but probably keep us all on our toes a little bit. And we're going to look at our next slide, which talks about the actual definition. So I've sort of told you, obviously, through a couple of visuals and just verbally, that resiliency is the ability to overcome hardship and recover quickly, and it's referred to as resilience. Now, quickly is a matter of time in anyone's mind. Quickly could be a few days, it could be a few weeks, a few months, okay? It just depends. All of us are different. So there is no timeline on how quickly you just become resilient, right? I can't just tell you, okay, well, in 7 to 10 days, they should be resilient and everything's good. That's impossible. We're all human beings. We all are going to suffer through emotional turmoil and different stressors in different ways. but we're going to come through it and overcome it, right? And just like it says here, some individuals confuse resilience with mental toughness, but resilience also means overcoming that emotional stress and suffering. And that's what I was referring to with COVID. While of course families sadly lost people to COVID, there was a ton of stress that was put upon our educational communities, just simply by putting our students in front of a computer screen, or just placing them, in a Zoom call or a Google Meet instead of the classrooms that they were so used to. But then watching them months or a year come back to those classrooms, letting them know how proud, of course, we are of them and our colleagues too, okay? And teaching them that that is resiliency. That is an ability that not everybody hones in on, but we can do more by teaching one another what we're able to do. People who are resilient have the strength to process and overcome adversity, and those who lack resilience are more likely to become more overwhelmed, the stressed out factor, right? They resort to negative coping mechanisms. And we see this in our students, we can see this in our colleagues, in our community as well. So negative coping mechanisms might be things like just simply withdrawing and maybe not attending as much, not attending school, not attending work, not attending business as usual, okay? They might be withdrawn in the sense that they just simply don't communicate as much. And sadly, that's one of just an easy human defense mechanism, is to just withdraw, because you don't have to do anything. You just step back and step away. But there are obviously many negative coping mechanisms. And to overcome these challenges and work through problems, resilient people rely on strengths and support systems. And the support systems part here is huge, okay? A lot of people do not like to ask for help. It's just part of us. My father always used to joke, we're Italian, we don't do things like that. We don't ask for help. We just figure it out. And it was probably not a great lesson. Love my father, but that probably wasn't a great lesson, because we need to ask for help. So it took me a long time to understand that, yeah, I could ask for help. And as educators and working in an educational community, we know that we have huge responsibilities and we have lots of weight on our shoulders, especially right now. But asking for help is the best thing we can do. Relying on one another, getting information from one another, and helping each other to understand what they're going through, especially right now, is the best way that we can become more resilient and develop our resiliency. So understand that support systems are huge. Developing support systems are huge, and we're going to try and touch on that as well this evening. So I'm going to look at our next slide, which is an assessment. And again, if you don't have a piece of paper and you just kind of want to tally these up in your mind, that's okay. But I want to give you a couple of minutes right now to look at this list of 10 statements. You're going to read through each statement and rate your own self. And I'm not going to collect scores, okay? But we're just going to kind of look and see what you have. 1 means not at all like you. A 10, that's totally you. You can be a 5, which is kind of in the middle, okay? You can be a 2 or an 8 or a 9, whatever you want to score yourself at. So I just want to give you a couple minutes. Let me put like maybe 2 minutes or 3 and see where you're at as far as a resiliency assessment. This assessment will also be available to you as a PDF and throughout, obviously, the presentation. And as you're completing it, I know I might be distracting your thought a bit, but it's a great assessment to kind of look at every so often. I'm not saying once a week or anything by any means, but looking at something like this now and maybe in a couple of months coming back to it. It's a good activity to kind of do just for yourself. to see where you're at, being truthful and honest with yourself, which is super important, and building on what you know about yourself, what you're learning about yourself, and what you want to learn more about within yourself. So this this assessment was sort of taken from the Onward source. It comes from a couple of things, but one thing that Elena Aguilar and others do talk about, and I mention her a lot only because a few years ago I was privileged to sit in a work group with her and about 10 other people, and we did some amazing stuff, and it was just really inspiring and encouraging. So I always encourage her work, but the one thing that she does encourage is having that support system. So you see it here, you saw it in the definition, you'll see that support system kind of come up a lot. This is tough stuff. We can't just do it by ourselves. We can't just do it on our own. We love to think that we can be Superman or Superwoman. Yeah, great. You know, for my 5-year-old, I was Superwoman for a long time, and then she became 14 and I wasn't that anymore. So we can be superheroes for our students, for our colleagues. We can definitely be superheroes. But in order to do that, we need that support system. So if you have a 10 and you have plenty of support from other people and you have a 10 on that, that's awesome. Okay. And again, no one's looking, no one's judging. We're not collecting data from this at all. Okay. But for yourself, just put an honest answer. And if it's something you need to work on, you need a bigger support system, then that's what you go out and work on. Adapting quickly to new developments. That's something we're very familiar with right now, because everything is changing in our educational community constantly. There's different schedules and different routines, and we're changing what students are doing and what student learning looks like, and even how they're coming to and from schools and when they're not at school, because there might be COVID cases. So new developments and adjusting to all of that is a tough one. And so again, if you have something like a 10 or a 9 on that, that's awesome. But some people don't adjust to change very quickly or just well at all. So making that something that becomes a little bit more familiar or more okay might be something you want to work on. Able to accept yourself for who you are. Modeling this for our students, for our educational community is huge. Not saying in front of your kids, oh, I just feel so messy. I really don't like my hair today. I'm just, oh, I have to stop eating like this. Be that role model. Be the one that they want to just look up at all the time, because whatever you put in front of them is what they're going to model back, right? Recover emotionally from losses. And again, sadly, we know more of this right now, but there's no timeline on healing and nurturing yourself and your soul back to whatever it may be. And there might not be back to a norm, but just to a place where there's at least some sort of comfort and healing going on. Feeling self-confident and appreciating yourself, also important. Modeling that for our students is super important. I'm very durable during tough times, which is our kind of our definition, right, of resiliency. But if we show that we have this armor and we show that we can, you know, persevere and do great things, great. But we also have to show that we are human. We ask for help. We ask for people's input in different places, right? It's not just we take on the world. We don't want to display that. I'm good at solving problems. I'm good at facing challenges, also important. I'm good at interacting at times of stress. Also, you know, we see sometimes that an outside thing has made us a little upset, has stressed us out. Maybe we just saw a text or got a phone call or an email, and kids are about to get on the bus and you're like, oh my God, how am I going to deal with all this right now, right? Showing kids that we're stressed out, probably not going to be super healthy for them. Maybe they have a story and, you know, in line for you that'll just cheer you right up or bring a smile to your face. You don't even know. Maybe they're your resiliency models, who knows? But us showing that stress that has to deal with an outside issue that has nothing to do, obviously, with them, needs to be kept somewhere and then dealt with and used it with a healthy coping mechanism. And I'll get into, if I have some time, healthy coping mechanisms to display in our educational community that we can mentor and use as well. I found benefits in bad experiences, definitely beneficial. And we can certainly model and display that for our community as well. All right, we're going to look at our next slide, which is a video from Angela Lee Duckworth. It's about 6 minutes long and we have some time to watch it. You may have seen it. It has been around for a little time, but what I love about this video is, well, how she explains basically perseverance, and she uses the word grit, and grit has become a big term in educational circles. But it's a very interesting take on our topic tonight. So we're going to take a view at this video.
When I was 27 years old, I left a very demanding job in management consulting for a job that was even more demanding, teaching. I went to teach 7th graders math in the New York City public schools. And like any teacher, I made quizzes and tests. I gave out homework assignments. When the work came back, I calculated grades. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. The kinds of things you need to learn in 7th grade math, sure, they're hard. Ratios, decimals, the area of a parallelogram. But these concepts are not impossible. And I was firmly convinced that every one of my students could learn the material if they worked hard and long enough. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. In education, the one thing we know how to measure best is IQ. But what if doing well in school and in life depends on much more than your ability to learn quickly and easily? So I left the classroom and I went to graduate school to become a psychologist. I started studying kids and adults in all kinds of super challenging settings. And in every study, my question was, who is successful here and why? My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future, day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. A few years ago, I started studying grit in the Chicago public schools. I asked thousands of high school juniors to take grit questionnaires and then waited around more than a year to see who would graduate. Turns out that grittier kids were significantly more likely to graduate, even when I matched them on every characteristic I could measure. Things like family income, standardized achievement test scores, even how safe kids felt when they were at school. So it's not just at West Point or the National Spelling Bee that grit matters. It's also in school, especially for kids at risk for dropping out. To me, the most shocking thing about grit is how little we know, how little science knows about building it. Every day, parents and teachers ask me, how do I build grit in kids? What do I do to teach kids a solid work ethic? How do I keep them motivated for the long run? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that talent doesn't make you gritty. Our data show very clearly that there are many talented individuals who simply do not follow through on their commitments. In fact, in our data, grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. So far, the best idea I've heard about building grit in kids is something called growth mindset. This is an idea developed at Stanford University by Carol Dweck, and it is the belief that the ability to learn is not fixed, that it can change with your effort. Dr. Dweck has shown that when kids read and learn about the brain and how it changes and grows in response to challenge, they're much more likely to persevere when they fail because they don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. So growth mindset is a great idea for building grit, but we need more. And that's where I'm going to end my remarks, because that's where we are. That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
Okay. So, I'm not sure if that's a video that you're familiar with or not, but the grit term, oh my goodness, that went crazy for a while. But it really ties in with this theme of resiliency, and the growth mindset, which some of you may be familiar with Carol Dweck's work, is super important. But again, during the time that we've been with our educational communities throughout COVID, if anything, we've seen growth mindset really take off too. We've been able to display to one another, to our community, to our students, that we are able to definitely make it through some really challenging times. And if anything, again, that this grit and perseverance, resiliency is something that we're learning tenfold, if anything, right now. And we're able to kind of bring that into our community and use it as a model, not being afraid to fail. A lot of students had that fear, especially students who were in our high schools and going through COVID, and what am I going to do now when they're taking us out of school, and am I going to be able to graduate, and am I going to make it? And we're seeing the effect of that now, where some students don't want to go back to school, and they have this mindset of withdrawing, and I'm not going to be able to do it. But with the amount of people in their educational community who have seen resilience, who are great models of being resilient people, they can change that mindset, that they can go through this, they can do this, they can get that diploma, they can keep going, and that nothing has to change except their own mindset. It doesn't have to be one way, right? So that grit and building that in our educational community is super important. All right, we're going to take a look at our next slide, which is the support system. Okay, and like I said, this is super important. It's a crucial part of the transition for people who might have a disability. Okay, it's also just simply having a group of people in your life to achieve things that you might want to achieve as far as goals or professional goals. But that support system can be different from the one at work to your personal one at home. It can be kind of a mesh group. It depends on what it is that you're looking at. Your support system. I tell my friend about my day and my projects I'm working on all the time. Okay. maybe you have a colleague that you meet with at the end of every week on a Friday or something, and you kind of catch up and hear each other out and do some really good, communication and good listening skills. That builds a great support system. Okay. Improving your support system would mean that you would have to look inward and understand that you need more. Okay, maybe you need a mentor. Maybe you need just somebody you can bounce ideas off of. If you're new to your educational community, if you moved from one place to another, like I just moved from New Jersey to Indiana in 6 months, I'm finding lots of new support systems throughout the area I'm living in. But you do have to do some legwork, and you do have to kind of network and move around and see what fit is there for you. A positive mental attitude and that open or growth mindset is super important. Just kind of seeing with those blinders on of, I'm just going to find A, B, C, and D, and that's it. That might not work. So being open-minded about the developments that you're going to be looking for. What is your positive mental attitude? So as you grow and find new support systems, are you also displaying signs of being optimistic and positive, or are you kind of pessimistic and you just kind of have a list of complaints? You might find different resources through that as you build your support system. And then, of course, how would you improve your positive attitude if that is something you feel, or maybe colleagues or somebody have said, hey, you got to take a more positive look at this, or maybe you just want to be a little bit more open-minded and have that growth mindset put forth. We're going to look at our next slide, which there's a worksheet, which I'll get to in a minute. Okay. And then there's some kind of tips for you guys that I want to go through as well. The knowing yourself and that assessment that we looked at is super important. Again, just kind of being able to look inwards and be honest, okay, and know what it is you might need to build your support system so that you can also work on this theme of resiliency and modeling it for your educational community. Understanding your emotions. So in SEL work and mindfulness work, which I do lots of, understanding emotions is huge. And a coping mechanism that we need in order to build resiliency is how to cope, how to deal with emotions. I could spend hours on just this topic alone, but we have a lot of good resources that are available to you. And one of them is this. There's many. Again, Castle has quite a few resources. This one is it's a wheel that's known as Plutnik's Wheel of Emotions. And if you, in this site, and again, this wheel is available on many different platforms, but on this site, if you click on a different part of the wheel, okay, it then goes into kind of learning more about that emotion. And again, we can spend lots of time with emotion. We might see kids in our library who are just all of a sudden just so upset and they're really sad, or they're very pensive. Okay. We might see kids in the cafeteria that we see every single day, and all of a sudden we see them in this red zone of being angered or enraged by something. We might see little Kelly at the bus or the bus stop by her crossing guard, and all of a sudden that happy little smile shows fear and she's a little apprehensive. Okay. We might do that through reading body language, or just getting to know the student more, because those are the students we see all the time and we kind of know them because of the personality they've been showing, but all of a sudden the emotions are changed or a little bit different. Because you are part of their educational community and their world, you pick up on those things, and you can then approach that with the knowledge of, hey, let's look at some of these emotions, or hey, you know what, there's a counselor that's available down the hall, and let's go talk to Mrs. Smith about some of these emotions you're having. But dealing with the emotions that our students are having or we're having, and showing our students that there are coping mechanisms and ways to deal with emotions instead of just bagging them up or putting them aside right now, telling a child, hey, don't worry about it. Don't worry, it'll go away. The other one I love is, hey, just take a deep breath. It'll be good. Okay, so I teach lots of courses in mindfulness. I never just say, just take a breath. I actually teach how to breathe. And it's something we just never do. We don't teach you how to breathe, you breathe, right? But learning how to breathe and how to take those breaths is a coping mechanisms that help to deal with emotions helping deal with building resiliency. So it all kind of goes together, right? But this is definitely worthwhile looking at some more. Not that any of us become cognitive therapists or psychologists or psychiatrists. We don't need to go there. We just need to be aware of these things that then are a part of our toolbox. And then we also have the resources in our educational community to say, hey, I know so-and-so who's a social worker, I know so-and-so who's a counselor, and we can use those then to move forward. The other document that I kind of wanted to show you, actually, I'm going to go back to the slideshow real quick. I'm sorry. So there's a worksheet that I might not have time to go through. It's called Protective Factors. It'll be available to you with this webinar. And it's a worksheet that you can fill out with some time, meaning maybe you want to sit down and understand better your social support system. If you need to build a better one, what skills and coping strategies you might need to better understand, and your own personal identification. So those are all things that are on this worksheet. And again, it'll be made available to you, but it's also something that you don't want to rush through. You might want to sit with it. We just got a foot of snow. I can't wait to sit and journal a couple of things because I can't go anywhere. So it's a healthy practice to look inwards and see where you want to develop a little bit more. It's a healthy practice to look at something like an emotions wheel. And believe me, if you Google emotions wheel, there's tons of them. This one is one that we use a lot and APA uses a lot. And I think it's important to at least just have a good understanding of what a basic emotion wheel is. Something you can go through with students eventually if you're a counselor or in that social worker role. Empowering stories. So this too, Elena Aguilar talks a lot about. There was a bus driver that she actually brought in to tell us about the stories that he would talk about on the bus rides home, because he was in Kansas and a lot of the rides were long. So it wasn't just like a 5-minute drop off, it was like a 35-minute drop off for almost every kid. And so he developed these kind of storytelling sessions, and the kids would sit in the bus and they would just listen to him. And it was really rather sweet, I thought, and amazing, because I've seen some bus rides with young ones and it's sometimes it's not. But they were empowering. So they weren't just storytelling time to pass the time. They were empowering stories, and it had to do all with a lot of family related things and how he was able to get this job at eventually. And you could see that the kids he told these stories to really understood them, and they couldn't wait to get back on that bus every day. And so again, another way of building resiliency. Modeling from learning mistakes. I never went in any of my classrooms saying I am perfect. I've never made a mistake. I taught lots of different material. I lived in Italy for 6.5 years. I taught Italian for quite some time. When I had to look in a dictionary for something, kids would just like balk at me. Why are you looking in a dictionary? How can you look in a dictionary? You speak Italian. Yeah, I do. I speak it quite well. And yeah, I lived there for quite some time. But why do I not know the word for, some bizarre seed that only grows in the northwest corner of Africa? Because I don't even know what that seed is. So how am I going to tell you what it is in another language? So yes, I make mistakes. I have to look things up. I need to build resources for myself, demonstrate that, show that we're human, right? That helps also build resiliency in our students. Setting brave and attainable goals, writing them out, making a class list, making a library list, making a hallway list. Some groups use hallways to kind of communicate things between students, and the educational community. But those are huge. They're really big. And then there's a ton more ideas on this document that too is also listed as a resource for you. And I believe on the next slide are some resources. So all the things I was talking about are here on the resource page. Elena's book is this onward download, I can speak, downloadable tools. And she has quite a few things that educational communities can utilize like today, which are great. Her book is awesome. And I'm not just saying because I, met and worked with her, but in this specific realm of what we're discussing, so much work and lots of activities and lots of different resources. And she's a great one to use. These are other TED Talks. There's two. They are longer. I think they're 12 minutes and 14 minutes. They're great to use with student populations, but they're also great to use with your colleagues for PD, for just any sort of, arrangement in which you're talking about SEL or resilience or something like that. So I highly recommend kind of watching them when you have some time, jotting down some notes. You can always use the TED Talks template. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, goes along with the TED Talk. So you guys can kind of piece out different parts of the talk and have a nice little discussion. These last two, this wheel, I did get to show you. And then this one is something that is Castle recommends, but a couple other people recommend it, and I've used it in some of my SEL training, is tapping into your positive traits activity, which can kind of be fun to do to see what positive traits you think you have and which ones you might want to develop a little bit more of. So those are the resources. And like I said, the other documents are here in the webinar. And if you guys have any questions, I believe right now is the time that you can ask me. You can put them in the Q&A box, or this is my contact information. That's my private email, but go ahead and use that if you do have any questions. I will be happy to help answer anything that you might have had a question on. I know a lot of times for myself, I come out of a webinar or a Zoom meet and there's so much information that I've been given, and then an hour later I'm like, oh, you know what? I really wanted to ask this. So if you have one of those moments, please feel free to email me. One of the questions I like to kind of finalize these SEL or these types of workshops with is, and I'm sure you've utilized a question like this, but if you met an older version of yourself, so maybe a version that's 10, 20 years older, okay, what kind of advice would you offer to this older self? And in your answer, you might have to dive a little deep to see what kind of answer you come up with. But it's a great question to ponder and see what you might want to offer as far as traits, support systems, coping skills, and how we deal with this. And would your resiliency be even stronger or more so down the road?
Thank you so much, Tara, for this informative presentation. That was really great. At this time, as you had mentioned, we are going to open up the floor for Q&A. We will address the questions in the order in which they've been received until we run out of time. And so we're about 5 minutes out to 8 o'clock. So we're going to answer as many questions as we can. And as a reminder that only questions that are posted in the Q&A feature will be included in this portion of the webinar. So please don't type questions in the chat. We want to capture them in the Q&A feature so that we can keep a question order. And at this time, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Crystal, who will help facilitate the questions. I see there's one question that did pop into the box. Crystal?
Thank you, Tara. This is a very informative evening. And so now we'll move into our Q&A. And so the first question in the Q&A box is, what is the connection between resiliency and meta competencies like higher order higher order and executive thinking?
I'm not mute. Okay. So yes, I'm just reading this myself. So that's kind of an interesting question. And I think it's a little bit of what the video touched on when they were looking at this building of grit of, is it higher order thinking that allows our students to persevere? Is it higher order thinking that allows CEOs to become even more powerful CEOs? Is it something like that? Or is it something else? And again, there wasn't really much of a connection in the data that they were able to collect. So I think, and again, that's why I picked that video, because it does show that, there were people out there, they were doing all this data collection, they were doing a lot of studies. They weren't super talented. They weren't super high, IQ. So the resiliency compared to these meta competencies might be a little bit different. We have two different ways of thinking, right? There's resiliency that you can build and just from watching modeled behavior. There's resiliency that can be built from personal experiences, but it doesn't come from the fact that somebody is a higher order thinker or has an IQ that's above average.
Thank you. And another question, what is the best way to start the resiliency conversation?
Okay, so if we're talking about starting a conversation in our community with adults, colleagues, educators, business leaders, whomever that may be, putting forth kind of a Q&A series of what is resiliency, that document that kind of outlines maybe some ideas of what resiliency is about. And then having maybe one or two, like I said, the storyteller types, where you have somebody from that community that people are very familiar with, somebody they know, somebody they trust, somebody they've seen a lot, and they feel comfortable. Of course, we're not forcing anybody, right? But they feel comfortable sharing a story about a personal experience that created a little bit more of a resiliency in them. So they're very self-aware of the fact that they have this resiliency. Because there's that connection, and you're more likely to have more people kind of start listening and getting into a part of that discussion. I've seen districts break these down into kind of like, they call them like town hall, just talks or discussions. And, they're optional for anybody in the community who wants to come, but they have a little bit of a connection because they're people that know each other, that network, that help one another in that educational community. And so they're more likely to become part of that discussion and kind of build, those discussions all year long, really, if they wanted to.
Awesome. And lastly, could you quickly give us, this last question is, especially during these times, how do you use mindfulness to build resiliency?
So mindfulness, like I said, is something I have been working with for a long time before COVID. And a coping skill that I teach most often is just the basic breath and how to breathe. We need to learn a little bit about neurology. We don't become full on neurological experts, of course, but understanding the connection that our brain has to emotions, to thoughts, to how we act or overreact or don't react, and connecting that to our breath and understanding the power that is there is a huge coping mechanism. And for a lot of people, it doesn't just happen. People leave a lot of time saying, well, yeah, I'm always breathing, so this is kind of silly. But when you finally have that connection where you can be still and quiet with a group of people or alone by yourself, and you feel that connection to your breath, to the connection to your emotions, to that slowing down or control over that emotion that you might be feeling very strongly at the time, that is a great starting point. it's a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight, but just slowly building a practice is really helpful. On the ed communities for NEA, there's a page I have called Mindful Educators, and I put a lot of resources up there for things just like this, for the educational community who wants to start a mindful practice, for the educational community who already has one intact and wants to add on to it, because there's a lot of different things that you can work on, but just that breath connection to emotion and to the kind of the power that we possess with that is super important.
Thank you, Tara. And that will conclude our Q&A for this evening.
So on behalf of the Center for Professional Excellence in Student Learning's NEA ESP Quality Department, I would like to once again thank our presenter tonight, Tara, as well as my colleague, Crystal Fox, for helping to moderate this tonight's webinar presentation. And thank you all for your participation this evening. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and good night from the NEA ESP Quality Department.